Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. Well, you know what that means. Have we set him at Mission Impossible? Well, I don't know if we've set him Mission Impossible, but I reckon we've come as close as we're ever going to get to actually achieving the feat. That is, setting him Mission Impossible. Richard S. Kazimer joins us. By the way, Richard S. Kazimer can be your friend on Facebook. That's all you need to look out for. Kazimer, spelled Kazimer, or if you're listening in America, that's Kazimer. I don't know about Mission Impossible, but it's one of these things where you can imagine that, like a lot of people, you'd be saying, never heard of it. We'll get to that in a moment. Morning, sir.
Good morning. How are you?
Not so bad. By the way, I believe that last Friday was your birthday. Happy birthday. I'm not going to ask how many have gone past because I suspect that, like me, you just simply stopped counting because, to be quite blunt, you just don't want to know anymore.
No, I don't. But if it gets to the point someone needs to know, they can just cut off my leg and count the rings.
Yeah. What was it somebody once said? You know you're getting old when somebody wants you carbon dated.
I'm so old, there was no carbon when I was born.
Yeah, I'm so old I was born before oil. Yes, I get it. Hey, so something that we've had recently was the Commonwealth Games. And while the Commonwealth Games are on, there are a few people who expressed opinions that, well, who really cares about the Commonwealth Games? The only games that truly matter, and the only games that many see as being truly international, are, of course, the Olympic Games. The Commonwealth Games, I suppose, as much as anything, I mean, they're, of course, the former Empire Games. They're as much about tradition as anything else, and I suppose for some countries, arguably, it gives them a chance to showcase some of their athletes. It probably also gives people some time to get themselves tuned up for the Olympics in a really competitive international type situation. But for a lot of the hardcore sports fans, they're a bit blah. They're not quite there. You know, it's like a second tier competition, if you like. And I was doing a little bit of sniffing around and I found out that there was a thing called the Pan American Games for America.
Indeed.
And I thought, well, we've got the Commonwealth Games every 4 years. The question that was asked this year, and I guess it's been asked before, was, you know, are things like the Commonwealth Games a good idea? Or should we just discontinue it and let the Olympics be the only major event? Has the same sort of question been asked about the Pan American Games? Because one of the things I discovered, and even when I first mentioned it to you, you thought, hang on a second, what are these games? It wasn't something that instantly rang a bell with you, was it?
No, and for a lot of other reasons, mainly because I'm probably the biggest non-jock. I pulled a hamstring just reading about the Subi Oval name change story, so you can see where I'm coming from. In my research, I found that the Pan American Games are an offshoot of the Latin American Games that began in the 1920s. In 1932, the organization PASO, P-A-S-O, the Pan American Sports Organization, formed the first Pan American Games that were held in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1943, or they were supposed to be, but a little incident called World War II caused a scheduling conflict, and the games were postponed until 1951. Now, since then, the Pan Am Games are held every 4 years, just like the Olympics, with the recent games including athletes from 42 countries, which include North, Central, South America, and then all the island countries that are in the Caribbean and so on. The next Pan Am Games are going to be a year from October. They'll be in 2011 in Guadalajara, Mexico. They are scheduled to be there in Guadalajara, and I use the term schedule loosely considering Mexico's recent spike in drug-related mass murders, and largely that the drug cartels are controlling the local government, so we'll see how Guadalajara pulls this off. There was a half-hearted attempt to create the Pan Am Winter Games in 1959, but not enough countries took interest. Living on or near the equator has a tendency to give the competitive edge to countries that actually have snow.
I think that's probably a fair comment. It must be one of the reasons why when it comes to Winter Olympics, Australia has never featured prominently, because we do have some snow, but in very limited areas and also in very generally isolated areas.
Absolutely. Canada seems to really shine in those events. And
gee, I wonder why.
Well, a country that invented hockey, basically. But unlike Canada, that covers the games quite extensively, here in the U.S., the Pan Am Games go virtually unnoticed. With as many cable and satellite sports networks that are available to us in the United States, none of the English-speaking networks cover the games at all.
You mean not even the cable networks?
No, not the English-speaking ones. No, they don't. Even the handful of newspapers that send reporters to wherever these games are, they send down second-string reporters. They take freelance submissions, or they use the reporter pool submissions. None of the coverage ever makes a front page here in the United States, regardless if an American wins a gold medal. There is word coming up for the next games that the U.S.-based ESPN sports network, but yet their Spanish network side is bidding on coverage for the 2011 games, but here too, not in English. Depending on your cable package, you can watch the games on feeds here in the United States, but the feeds are coming from Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile.
Which essentially means, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you don't speak Spanish, you're going to have trouble understanding the commentators.
Or Portuguese, which is the official language of Brazil. And I could walk down a couple of blocks down in the center of town here in Woburn, Massachusetts, which has a huge Brazilian population, and I could go into any number of restaurants and bistros here, and I'm sure they will have the Pan Am Games on, but nothing in English.
Which means that you'll need somebody to act as a translator. Now, why is it, bearing in mind that Americans are sort of noted for their love of sport, a bit like we are, why is it that something like that, if for no other reason other than it gives people a chance to watch and perhaps even participate in some sports, why have they never really fired the imagination? Is it because, maybe it sounds a bit snobby, but is it because they think that they're just not big enough?
That's a good point. And even though the United States has hosted the Pan Am Games in 1959 in Chicago, in 1987 in Indianapolis, and the United States also holds the most amounts of gold and total medals won in all of the Pan Am competitions, there is a definite lack of interest among the U.S. athletes competing. I think it may have to do with they send the B teams down to compete. It could be out of snobbery. It could be out of cockiness. That's anyone's guess. But with the history of the U.S. dominating the games by going deep in the benches, there doesn't seem to be a need to send the star athletes down for any better representation. Another reason could be there are more prestigious competitions occurring generally at the same time that the Pan Am Games are going on elsewhere on the planet, and these are more advantageous for star athletes to attend. Nobody wants to risk injury competing in a lesser tier event when you can go for the gold in the majors, especially when there's potential lucrative sports contracts and commercial endorsements on the line.
Yeah, I suppose when you're also looking at the fact that the Olympics are not that far away. Hey, one of the things I have noticed is if you have a look at our Commonwealth Games, they occurred this year, which was virtually halfway between the two Olympics, of course, with the Olympics in 2008 and then the next one's due in 2012. The Commonwealth Games sort of sit nicely in the middle. Do you think that part of the problem with the Pan Ams is that they're too close to the Olympics? I mean, you're talking about 2011, and when you talked, for example, about injury concerns and the potential for injuries, I guess that's more of a worry a year out from the Games than 2 years out from the Games.
It could also have to do with the caliber of the athlete, where unlike a lot of the nations, the United States never has had a government-supported sports program. So all the athletes that compete in the world competitions have to obtain their own funding, either from personal finances or sponsorship money. Now, if you accept the money from outside or commercial sources that might be acceptable to compete in the Pan Am Games, that also might disqualify you from competing in the Olympics or even bar that athlete from competing in their own college teams if they're a college athlete. So depending on the criteria of what the Pan Am Games, some athletes that are maybe in the amateur status will or will not be able to compete in them, and they may or may not be able to compete in the Olympics if they do so, if I'm making any sense. What quantifies an amateur athlete, which years ago used to be the criteria to be in the Olympics? However, we're seeing professional basketball players from the United States competing in the Olympics, whereas someone who's in gymnastics or speed skating, for example, cannot have any professional career outside of that. So I think there is that where people are walking that fine line on their eligibility for future games and other games, and you don't want to blow it by competing in the Pan Am Games, which, again, is really not that big of a deal.
Actually, it's interesting when you talk about the fact that they're now, in some areas, relaxing the requirements for the Olympics in the sense that the people can be professionals and playing in the Olympics. Has that had an effect on games like the Pan Ams, do you think?
And looking looking at the lack of big names in star athletes and U.S. athletes. I mean, Mark Spitz comes up as the famous swimmer, competed in the Pan Am Games, but he is probably the most noted U.S. athlete that ever competed in the Pan Am Games and then went on to compete and gain international fame from his winnings in the Olympics. I can't find anybody in my research of recent caliber that competed in the Pan Am Games of any note. So I don't really know. I don't think it's a big enough deal to be sending down star athletes when they can be concentrating more on games of caliber like Commonwealth Games or the Olympics or the Tour de France.
We see, I suppose, when you start to talk about the Commonwealth Games, I suppose essentially for Commonwealth countries, they're on a par with the Pan Am Games. I guess at some point we might be, and this might also have some effect, I guess, on the Pan Am Games as well. Is there a potential for overload in some areas? I mean, sometimes people say there are too many sports distributed at one time. Could that indeed be the case, and that it distracts from other sports as well?
It could. This is so much different than Formula One racing, for example, where all you're talking about is a machine. So, if you have several cars in your stable to run and you have two drivers, that's a lot different than one runner or one pole vaulter or one team going from Pan Am Game to Commonwealth Game to Olympics in a 2-year period. And that does a lot of wear and tear on people. Plus, these people either have to go to school, hold full-time jobs. It is very difficult because they're not professional athletes. They are professional people. And that makes the difference where you really have to pick and choose where you're going to get your notoriety and where you're going to place your competition without risking bankruptcy and potential career-ending injuries.
Actually, when we talk about all of these games, and I guess that also includes the Olympics, is there an argument to say that perhaps we ought to go to the point where we say, okay, no professionals can enter? I mean, obviously what you're going to want are the best of the amateurs, but no professionals. Do we need to go back to that, do you think? And if we did go back to that, would that elevate the status of things like the Pan Am Games for yourself and things like the Commonwealth Games for us?
I don't see any reason why you can't have both in separate events. Totally clean amateur games and then have the best of the professionals, which I think that's what the Olympics have become, is that you're actually pulling people who are playing professional sports and competing. There's any number of opportunities for professional basketball teams of international status to compete against each other, or football teams for that matter. You've got the World Cup and so on. So I don't see why you can't have a totally separate game and get back to the amateur level of what the Olympics were 50, 60 years ago. So I don't see any reason why you can't have both. It's paying for it and drawing the crowd, which is where you run into the problem. One of the reasons the Pan Am Games aren't covered here in the United States by U.S. media outlets is that you can't pay for it. Every time the Olympics are on, whatever network outbids the other one to grab it goes into the red. They lose money hand over fist covering these games, because if you're going to cover them live and it's in another country, for example, if it's in Australia and you're 12 hours ahead of us, that means in order to watch this live, you're going to have to sit up and at the wee hours of the morning watching this. And if you don't, it's going to be spoiled for you because you already know the scores when they run the taped versions of it or the highlights. So it's got to make somebody money. Unfortunately, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I was going to say, judging by what you say, there have been many circumstances where US networks have not made money out of the Olympics. So it kind of makes you wonder, would they really be at any disadvantage by supporting games like the Pan Ams, even if they were on something like cable networks or something of that nature?
It's going to be a hard sell, especially if the feed is in another language. If you don't send a full-blown staff of English-speaking reporters and sports analysts down, then you're generally are relying on the feed from that country. And a lot of times that is the exclusive. Now, I've seen that too in formula racing that we're picking up here from Japan, for example, or South and Central America, that the U.S. announcers have to get the feed from that country's network of choice. If the camera is not focused on the U.S. driver or someone that they're talking about, you're out of luck. So you have to have that sort of greasing of the palms, a gentleman's agreement as to everything that's going to be covered. And if it's not, it doesn't make any sense to send anybody down to cover it. You have to maintain some sort of control if you're going to have it on your network. And heretofore, that hasn't happened.
Yeah, well, see, just listening to all your conversation about this and how it's all gone, it sort of makes me wonder, is the US going to continue its involvement in things like the Pan Am Games, or do you think eventually it really is just going to fall to such a second tier as far as the US is concerned that nobody's really going to bother about it because nobody's going to want to spend the money to be involved in it because there isn't really going to be any kudos at the end?
Well, as I mentioned, since the United States doesn't have a national sports program, if they send a team of athletes down for a team sport, that's one thing. I think it's a lot easier for a team of people to go down because they can get sponsorship to send 4, 5, or 8 people down to compete. However, if you're a single athlete and you can't come up with the money to go down there, you're out of luck. Whether America shows up and is represented in the Pan Am Games next year, I don't think it's going to make any difference. It's whoever can pony up the money and show up. If you don't have enough people, you don't compete. If you have enough people to compete in one event, then that person competes. But generally, from a national level, nobody really cares.
Yeah, I suppose at some point we're probably, we talk about things that we can afford to be involved in and things we can't afford to be involved in. It strikes me some of these events are probably going to fall victim to the same thing over a given period of time, and perhaps arguably some of these things have merely survived simply because of the tradition. It's a debate that's been had about the Commonwealth Games here. What's been the care factor? Well, certainly compared to the Olympics, the care factor would have to be described, I guess, as smaller and diminishing. Clearly the same thing would be the case with the Pan Am Games. Finding people in America who've actually heard of them was really difficult. I mean, I made you stop for a moment when I first mentioned them, didn't I?
If America doesn't compete in the Pan Am Games, the Pan Am Games can go on infinitum because if only one country of 42 countries that are participating doesn't show up, the Games will go on. It's a big deal for the Canadians and it's a big deal for South Central America and all the island countries. If America doesn't show up and then somebody else gets a chance to win gold medals, they're all for it.
Yeah, I guess that's the case. But, the other thing that does surprise me is the fact that they don't use, and I often think with our athletes, they certainly do use the Commonwealth Games for this. They're a really good live trial against international competition. Even if it's not, the games themselves are not something that really fires the public in the country up in the way that, say, the Olympics do. And certainly here, I mean, to really fire things up in a sporting sense, you have to be talking about top tiers. Anything less than top tiers doesn't sort of seem to have that mass appeal, which sometimes I've got to say is not fair. However, if you take that on board, you can't help but think that things like that, apart from the fact that they might help the games themselves, you also can imagine that it would be a really good chance for people to live practice, if you want to put it that way. They get some actual experience outside of what they're getting in the training track and that sort of thing.
Well, there's no shortage of venues for athletes to show their stuff. If you're a college athlete, the NCAA tournaments that are going on, any collegiate sport is featured hugely here. There's a lot of focus on college basketball, baseball, football, track and field. So there are a lot of opportunities for those athletes. The marathons, the New York and the Boston marathons, two of the most prestigious marathons in the world, are featured here. Crew racing. There's a lot of opportunities here in the United States and globally for these athletes to show their stuff and to win medals and get notoriety beyond and outside of the Pan Am Games. So I don't see that that's an issue.
All right, my friend, as always, I've got to thank you very much for your time. By the way, if you'd like to be this man's friend on Facebook, Richard S. Kazimer, Kazimer is his name. In the meantime, my friend, thank you, and we shall chat next week.
All right, brother. Play hard and pass the liniment.